This is a version of the presentation given at the 2021 Diagrams Conference. It updates the published conference paper, which is cited here. Wittgenstein uses pictures and diagrams in his texts. Images present a problem for layout, indexing and retrieval, and interpretation in both print and digital environments. We are mainly focused on issues of representation and appearance, that is, syntactics and grapholinguistics, and tagging, that is, semantics and the metatext. Our application is the open access Wittgenstein source, which is a facsimile and transcription of Wittgenstein's manuscripts, and the accompanying Wittgenstein ontology project, which is an indexing and semantics project. We took the published works, in which there are about 409 images, in which clear boundaries have been set between what is an image and what is not, and took that as a pilot for our proposed project to integrate image and text analysis in the Nachlass, that is, in the manuscripts, where there are between 2,000 and 3,000 images. So, what is the problem? The best known images are block or paragraph images, that is, intersentential diagrams or images, that is to say, they occur between sentences. The indicators for this are a preceding full stop or a sentence terminal punctuation, followed by a sentence initial majuscule or capital letter. Note that as a result we have a centered image with line separation both before and after. In contrast to the duck rabbit, we focus on intrasentential images, that is, images within the opening and closing sentential markers. In this example, the image is apparently part of the sentence, using our previous indicators. Like the duck rabbit, it is large, greater than the line height, and interrupts the running text, which says, "No," and then the image, "conceivable experience," etc. But using the open access manuscript source at wittgensteinsource.org shows that this location is misleading as it is represented in the published works. Wittgensteinsource.org has Wittgenstein's complete writings in facsimile, diplomatic and normalized transcriptions. Facsimile means a high-resolution photographic reproduction of the original manuscript pages themselves. Diplomatic means a typewritten transcription, including all the variations represented before they are interpreted. And normalized means an editorial selection of the optimum version of the variations, for example, as found in the published works, that is to say, after the text has been interpreted. Here, the image in the transcription appears in a red square and actually is a pop-up, and it seems to be located correctly at the start of the sentence, which begins "habe ich." This example not only interrupts the running text, but seems to have a grammatical role in the sentence. That is to say, the images are word substitutes. Note that the sentence cannot be read aloud, which we call prosodic failure. Interestingly, the sentence is in quotation marks. That is to say, these quotation marks cannot indicate speech, as they normally do. Also, there are implications for the metatext. That is to say, one cannot use an alt text that says triangle for the first image or arrow for the second, since the triangle, or so-called triangle, is functioning more as a pointing shape. So the first image really is intended to indicate a direction rather than a form. Here is the corresponding manuscript source, and in this case the images are more or less line height, reinforcing the idea that these are word substitutes and have a syntactic function. In the corresponding diplomatic transcription that we see here, the so-called triangle is incorrectly located. It should be in between ich sehe and als. Furthermore, a choice has been made to use a line height Unicode southeast pointing arrow instead of the arrow image. This opens the discussion of whether any or all arrows of a similar appearance are tokens of a single type. And this is part of the larger manuscript interpretation of orthographic tokens as types. That is to say, the question whether letter forms and ciphers, etc., could be universalized as Unicode symbols of individual images. We note that intrasentential images form part of the text grammar, that is to say, how the content is written. Intrasentential images could be investigated linguistically because they are part of the sentence. What did we do? Well, normally the encoding of images renders them invisible, as we see in the foreground example of some encoded text. We wanted to investigate them as word substitutes, so we encoded them so that corpus analysis software could see them and interpret them as though they were words in context, as you see in the background image. As a result, we could do collocations of words and images. For example, in this case, collocations of images with the word see. We could also undertake structural analyses of parts of speech and how these images were acting as word substitutes in the structure of the sentence. This will eventually enable us to say how intrasentential images contribute to the sentences and concepts. We operationalize these observations by a focus on objective structural features such as punctuation in association with images. We hoped to learn about images in relation to the concepts of samples, rules, proofs, and perhaps hinges. Hinges are fundamental non- or pre-epistemological propositions that underpin our understanding of the world. They belong to what Moore called common sense statements. And as an example, we thought that iconicity may be a hinge concept owing to its clear but ineffable relationship to what it represents. We acknowledge that the limitations of our study include that semantic interpretation is always implicated, even though we prioritise the manuscript evidence, for example, the diplomatic transcription. Our pilot sample is in English, which introduces some differences to the manuscripts, which are mainly in German. A manuscript complexity is greater than the complexity of our sample, because it contains more varied notation and it contains a lot of unstandardized, unconventional or unique tokens or types. And there is an unclear quantification owing to boundary cases. So what did we find? We found that intrasentential diagrams impact on prosody, as previously mentioned. So the concepts become communicable through writing, but not through speech, or speech alone. Page layout matters, so whether a diagram is intra or intersentential is currently obscured or misrepresented by how the images are laid out in the published works. There is an emerging text grammar, for example, that terminal diagrams have a stop suppression function. That is to say, there tends to be no full stop after a diagram, although there are exceptions. And the main theorists on punctuation, who are Nunberg and Jones, their theories cannot be mapped directly onto Wittgenstein's praxis. And so we think there is something to be found out there about Wittgenstein's unconventional use of punctuation. Specifically, in relation to our interests, we found that 71% of the images occur as intrasentential examples. And we thought that was a high or unconventional proportion of images acting as word substitutes rather than simply sitting between sentences. And we thought it was notable as a result that there was significant prosodic failure, meaning that the text can no longer be read aloud, and that seems to us to be significant in texts that are about the philosophy of language and the limits of language. 20% are terminal, that is to say, they occur at the end of a sentence, often as what is called a colon expansion, so coming after a colon, implying that they are a descriptive sample of what has been said. We're unsure what the findings are here. Definitive samples are related to identifying propositions. We discussed this in the published paper, but since then we have become more sceptical about the correctness of our differentiation of propositions from non-propositions using the tools that we said we were going to use. Quotation marks, of which about 5% of the images in the published works consist, quotation marks cannot indicate the spoken word. So we argue that they relate to an image-led assertion. That is, they challenge the Phrygian notion that appears in Wittgenstein, particularly in his early works, that an image can only show a possibility, but not an assertion that this actually pertained or happened. In our published paper, we note that this is a strong argument from Anscombe. Only 3% of the images are collocated with the word rule, which was another one of our interests. That is to say, the frequency of images collocated with the word rule is less than the overall frequency of the word rule itself. And this might imply that rule is not a visual concept. However, our experience of the texts suggests this would be an incorrect conclusion, and so we need a finer net to catch the associations here. Similarly, only 1% are collocated with the concept proof. But the collocations do identify exemplars of images as both rules and proofs in these last two cases, so both proof and rule need deeper investigation. In summary, we are trying to build a text grammar, following Nunberg and Jones, of Wittgenstein's picture sentences, and that's based on indicators from grapholinguistics. And that concludes the presentation.